예, 이제 저희 세션 1분 후에
Ladies and gentlemen,
시작하겠습니다.
we will begin session 2-2 in 1 minute.
예, 반갑습니다. 저는
Good afternoon,
2022년
ladies
한반도
and
국제평화포럼
gentlemen. I am the
세션
moderator of
2-2
session
동북아 지정학과
2-2 of the
한반도
Korea
대탄
Global Forum for
제목으로
Peace
사회자를
2022.
맡고
Our
있습니다.
topic
국립
is Northeast Asian
통일교육원의
Geopolitics and
김지영입니다.
Détente of the Korean Peninsula. I am Kim Jiyoung, professor at the National Institute for Unification Education.
2022년 미중 전력 경쟁이 심화되고
Our session
동북아의
deals
지정학적
with the
충돌 가능성이
situation
고조되는 상황에서
in the
한반도의
region
위기
with
국면을
heightened
극복하고 남북 관계를
competition
개선하기
between
위한 새로운
U.S. and
전략과
China and the
정책을
possibility
모색하는
of
자리를
a
마련하고자
geopolitical
합니다.
clash. We tend to seek new strategies and policies to overcome the crisis on the Korean Peninsula. We will take a look at the situation that is frustrating many, including the Ukraine war. We will not be able to obviously give answers and solutions, but we would like to propose possible solutions. For Korean, please press 3, and for English, please press 4 for interpretation services. We are joined by online participants joining us via YouTube. I have a quick housekeeping note for you as well. There is a QR code if you look at YouTube. If you take a picture of this QR code, you can join us in the Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please use the QR code to post your questions. So if you do so, we will gather your questions and possibly try to answer your questions during the Q&A sessions. Allow me to introduce the presenters of this session. Our first presenter is Mr. Kim Dong-gi, who is head of the Innovo Research Center. Our second presenter is Professor Min Kyung-tae of the National Institute for Unification Education. Our third presenter is Director of Defense Policy Studies at the Korea National Defense University, Mr. Kim Young-jun. And last but not least is Dylan Motin, who is a PhD candidate at the Gangwon National University. We are also joined by two discussants, Professor Nam Gi-jung of the Institute for Japanese Studies at Seoul National University, and Mr. Lee Chol, who is a senior research fellow at the Peace Foundation. So I introduced the theme of our session and briefly introduced our participants. We have many presenters and also discussants, so I think I will have to manage time very strictly. We will now invite Mr. Kim Dong-gi for his presentation, Geopolitical Imagination, Possibilities of Improved DPRK-U.S. Relations. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As introduced, I am Kim Dong-gi. Today, I would like to take a look at the geopolitical situation, and I would like to look at the possibility of improved relations between the DPRK and the U.S. In order to improve relations, they have to have a shared interest that can be strategically shared, and I believe that containing China can be that strategic interest. So I will talk about the U.S.'s China strategy, and then I will take a look at the relationship between the DPRK and China, and then ultimately I will look at the possibility of improved relations between the DPRK and the U.S. Now let us take a look at the U.S.'s China strategy. Nicholas Spykman in 1942, in his book America's Strategy in World Politics and the Geography of the Peace, predicted the rise of China, and he emphasized the need to contain China.
일본의 군사력을 완전히 훼손시키지 않고 일정 부분 보존해서
He felt the need to preserve Japan's military, even though Japan was an enemy state, in order to contain China. In national security strategies announced by the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administration in 1988 and 1990 respectively, they state as the most important strategic goal for the U.S. to holding back any hostile country or national alliance from dominating the Eurasian continent. At the time, they were trying to contain Russia, but this can apply to China as China has emerged as a powerful country. In December 2017, the Trump administration defines explicitly China and Russia as strategic competitors, and the Biden administration in March 2021, in its interim national security strategic guidance, states that a key mission is to win in the competition against an assertive and authoritarian China. And Secretary of State Blinken, in May this year, at a Asia Society meeting, said that China has the willingness to change the international order, and it is the only country that has the capacity in terms of the economy and military and technology to do so. Now let's take a look at the relation between DPRK and China. Because of time constraint, I will skip over some slides. There is actually a lot of internal tension between the DPRK and China, and not many people are fully aware of this. Professor Sun Sua of China's Hwadong Teachers College, in an interview with the New Yorker, said that North Korea could attack China someday. And he said that the Chinese do not want a nuclear North because it is also a threat to China. And some people might find this comment very strange. But from the point of view of Chinese experts, they feel that the North's nuclear weapons could threaten China as well. In 2018, when DPRK-U.S. relations warmed, China's North Korea policy changed accordingly. They held DPRK-China summits in a very short period of time on 5 separate occasions so as not to be excluded from the DPRK-U.S. summit. China is actually concerned that the DPRK will normalize relations with the U.S. to the extent or that it will hurt China's interest or at China's expense. So they are very fearful that North Korea will cooperate with Korea and the U.S. strategically at China's expense. Nixon normalized ties with China via a visit to China, and China feels that the Trump and Kim Jong-un meeting is quite similar, and so China was able to warm ties with the U.S. at the time, so why not North Korea? And so China claims that it is a party to the denuclearization of North Korea and peace agreement. So they are making these claims so that they are not excluded from the process. And they have eased economic sanctions against North Korea. They are providing agricultural support. Even after the failure of the 2019 Hanoi talks, China is still concerned that North Korea may take a strategic turn against China, that it will hurt Chinese interest and take a different strategy that excludes China. And in 2019 and 2020 and 2021, China has limited economic relations with the DPRK, and the DPRK there are many sanctions against DPRK. So there is some trade, but there is a limited transaction and trade between China and the DPRK right now. According to Li Nan of the Chinese Academy of Science, Li Nan said in August that China is still very concerned that DPRK-U.S. relations will become tighter and that this will be used to contain China. So this rift in the DPRK in China, this may have significance and implication for the U.S. China's economic hold on North Korea is insufficient in impacting DPRK decisions. I think we need to be fully aware of this and take this into consideration. And North Korea, for a very long time, has made efforts to move away from excessive dependence on China. And to that end, it has worked to smooth relations with the U.S. It is trying to limit the influence of China through its ties with the U.S. So this rift in DPRK-Sino relations is a diplomatic opportunity for the U.S. The North, as I mentioned earlier, has made efforts to minimize the influence of China. And during the Cold War, it used its relations with the former USSR to keep China in check. And we need to take this into consideration and into account in improving DPRK-U.S. relations. The U.S. could take a fresh strategic approach, keeping this rift between the DPRK and China in mind. And if they do so, they could possibly form a geopolitical structure favorable to the U.S. in the region. So what then do U.S. experts think about this situation? I would like to introduce two scholars. First is Professor Walter Russell Mead. He is a professor at Bard College and a researcher at the Hudson Institute. He wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal titled "Détente may be an option with North Korea." This is actually very groundbreaking. He says that the U.S. has pursued denuclearization of North Korea for the past 30 years, but realistically speaking, this is impossible. And in fact, North Korea's missile and nuclear capacity has only strengthened and advanced. And China is emerging very quickly, and it is now a powerful country. If China and Russia join hands, this is the biggest threat to the U.S. And so the U.S. foreign policy needs to reflect this reality. And from North Korea's perspective, they do not want this high dependency on China, and this dependency on China is unfavorable and fearful for DPRK. So the stronger China becomes, North Korea is likely to want to keep its distance with China. During the Kim Jong-un and Trump meeting, North Korea was interested in establishing entirely new relations with the U.S. And the idea that the North will come to terms if sanctions are added is only likely to create confusion. This is what the article states. North Korea is looking for ways to minimize China's influence. It is trying to come up with a strategy to that end. And the U.S. needs to consider what it could get out of such a strategy. So what the professor proposes is for the U.S. to pursue détente by putting the nuclear issue aside for the time being, to work toward building a favorable balance of power in East Asia by establishing a new relation with North Korea. China is the biggest threat in the Indo-Pacific region, not North Korea. This is what the article states. Former USFK commander Vincent Brooks and former deputy commander Im Ho-young published an essay called A Grand Bargain with North Korea. I believe that Vincent Brooks, former commander Vincent Brooks, his idea is more evident in the essay. He proposes that the core strategic goal is to create a new balance of power aimed at reducing China's influence. So the idea is to improve relations with North Korea and to include it as part of a new order established by the U.S. and South Korea. In other words, the U.S. should completely change its isolation strategy and containment strategy against North Korea. He proposes that Korea and the U.S. build a new order by embracing North Korea, and this could bring a great change to the geopolitics of Northeast Asia. So the basic idea of Vincent Brooks and the Professor Mead is to use the DPRK, China's rift, to the advantage of the U.S. I also want to mention the U.S.'s fiscal crisis from the mid to long term. This fiscal crisis will have an impact on its status in Northeast Asia. The U.S.'s total debt is quite significant, and in 2031 it's expected to reach 107.5%. The interest expense has also increased. In 2022 alone, interest expense is posting $400 billion. And former Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S., Michael Glenn Mullen, has pointed out that debt is in fact the biggest threat to the U.S. national security. He says it's not Russia and it's not China. If interest expenses rise, then defense expenditure is likely to decrease. Then this will have an impact in geopolitics in Northeast Asia. As you can see in this graph, you can see that interest expense will exceed Medicare and Social Security. If you look at this graph, net interest costs were around 7% of federal revenues, but in 2040 it exceeds 25%, and defense expenditure and spending is likely to decrease correspondingly. So is there a possibility to improve relations between the DPRK and the U.S.? Well, there are a few preconditions. First is that the U.S. must realize North Korea's new strategic value, and the U.S. Political situation and the U.S. debt situation, if it worsens, then it's more likely that the U.S. will realize this value. And of course, the North Koreans must agree with U.S.'s initiative. And as a person who has watched and followed China for a long time, I believe that the North is likely to come on board. And another precondition is that the U.S. must have a faith that Korea will continue to be part of this alliance. If South Korea decides to push for the withdrawal of U.S. forces, then it will be difficult to improve DPRK and U.S. relations. And Japan must not interfere with this process. And of course, the public opinion in both Korea and the U.S. Must favor this sort of strategic change. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I apologize for not being able to give you more time. You talked about 3 major points.
So you went over through some history of U.S. détente. You also looked back at the DPRK-China relations, and you also touched upon how we can reorganize DPRK and U.S. relations, and you introduced the views of Vincent Brooks and Professor Mead. And you also talked about how this can relate to the DPRK-U.S. relations, and you highlighted that what is important is for the U.S. to realize North Korea's new strategic value.
Next, we will hear from Professor Min Kyung-tae. The title of his presentation is Can North Korea be the next Vietnam? Hello everyone, my name is Min Kyung-tae from the National Institute for Unification Education. I believe that this session is quite significant because the inter-Korean relations is in a stalemate, and the U.S.-North Korea relations have also soured. So I truly hope that today's session will serve as an opportunity to open up dialogue. The title of my presentation is Can the DPRK be the next Vietnam? To give you an answer, well, we first need a great transformation in Northeast Asia. Will we be able to formulate a new strategy for the future of the Korean Peninsula? Let us look into that. First and foremost, I will briefly talk about the geo-economic strategy for the Korean Peninsula. As you can see here, we have continental powers and sea power states, and Korea is located in between. And Korea is surrounded by water on 3 sides. And because of this center of gravity, it's not easy for the 2 Koreas to stay close because of the geopolitical clashes surrounding the Korean Peninsula. So from the geopolitical stance, we need to look into the economic and geographic factors to come up with a solution. So the maritime powers and the continental powers are clashing, and we need a solution to address that. The result is this. The neighboring countries need to participate in the Korean Peninsula's profit-sharing system. So when the 2 Koreas' relations sour, then the benefits and the interests of the neighboring countries actually increase, and that vicious cycle has been reinforced over time. So all the strong powers surrounding Korea have gained benefits from the confrontation and conflict between the 2 Koreas, which is why we need to overcome such circumstances. We need to be able to share the profit that comes out of a good inter-Korean relations, which is why we need to establish such a profit-sharing system on the Korean Peninsula. These are some of the examples. Let's say that if Korea, Japan, and China were to participate, then we could construct the Gyeonggi Line high-speed rail and expressway south of Pyongyang. China could construct the railway north of Pyongyang, and Japan from Wonsan to Pyongyang. We could build such a network to engage the neighboring countries. So the 6-party talk members, if we were able to include the US and Russia as well, and make sure that they fully participate in this network, be it resource development or tourism programs and so on, we could enjoy co-prosperity and share the benefits. So give up the benefits coming from the division of the two Koreas, but benefit from the profit that is generated on the Korean Peninsula. We could make that shift. So Korea could act as a bridge and serve as a hub in this region. And that is to maximize the benefit of the geo-economic aspect of Korea. But that's not easy because of the hegemonic war between the US and China, as well as the invasion of Ukraine. So as you can see here, the US relations with Russia have deteriorated while China and Russia became closer. So Korea wants to serve as a bridge between continental powers and maritime powers. However, that is not easy because of this geopolitical landscape. And we also see a decoupling of the supply chain from the US side. And given those circumstances, it's not easy to serve as a bridge. Then what this means is that we need to be more patient and wait and see and devise a new strategy. What I have in my mind is that we need to improve the relations between the two Koreas. We need to make a paradigm shift and explore the potential for transforming Northeast Asian geopolitics. Of course, this is not easy because of the strategic war between the US and China. And the US is containing China with various strategies, including blockage of military, economic, and technological alliances. And Taiwan is also relevant to Korea because it can have implications for the Korean Peninsula. So, of course, it's not likely that a conflict will be a full-scale conflict. However, it is very likely that tensions over conflict in the Taiwan Strait will lead to a limited war on the Korean Peninsula. Then the US forces for the foreseeable future will be stronger than that of North Korea. There's no doubt to that. However, in 5 years' time or within 5 years' timeline, there can be clashes in Taiwan Strait. Then that means that the US troops in Korea and in China should engage in some sort of conflict in the region, which means that when there are clashes in the East China Sea and the West China Sea, then the landscape in Korea should stabilize. Because unless it is stable, the US troops will not be deployed to the East and West China Sea. On the other hand, for now, North Korea is witnessing the clashes in China and the Taiwan Strait, but now the DPRK has a leverage, but if we make sure that the DPRK loses its leverage, then we have an opening. And in that process, we could extend deterrence. And as a result, we could alleviate the tensions on the Taiwan Strait. And as the previous speaker mentioned, the former commander, Brooks, mentioned a possible alliance with the DPRK. So we should assist the DPRK with economic growth and make sure that they rely less on China. And by doing so, we could ask the DPRK to join the U.S.-Korea alliance. And the Korean businesses can also make some investment in the DPRK, and the US could buy products from that network. And of course, is this possible? Because the US really values ideology and values. So maybe this may sound like it's a daydream, but if we can transcend ideology and values, then we could achieve something. The US and Soviet Union reached a détente with China. And the Nixon government also achieved a great transformation. And in the 1990s, after 20 years after the Vietnamese War, Vietnam received investment from the West. And it's been 70 years since the end of the Korean War. Then why are we not seeing any progress or change on the Korean Peninsula? Well, from the strategic point of view, the DPRK believes that it's better for them to stay close to China. However, because of the US-China strategic competition, it's time to make a change, to drive a change. So the geopolitical role of the DPRK could change. In the past, the DPRK was the axis of evil, which is why the US deployed their troops here in Korea, and that was their rationale. And the US and China, they were on the surface on a good term. However, they were competing behind the doors. And before, what they did is that they called the DPRK the axis of evil and used it as a main enemy. However, now the situation has changed. So now the role of the DPRK has decreased. If, Russia invaded Ukraine because they denuclearized and they wanted to go east. Now, what would happen going forward? Well, from China's point of view, they need to be aware that the DPRK's nuclear weapons can target China. The previous speaker mentioned that. So we have to understand that the DPRK can be a double-edged sword. So we have to be aware of that and use it strategically. The DPRK is advancing their nuclear weapons, but because we're not backed by China and Russia, we cannot deter the DPRK. Then what about the DPRK? Will they respond to the transition of the geopolitical situation in Northeast Asia? They suggested the need for stable management of the situation on the Korean Peninsula under the US-China strategic competition. They said we should focus on stably managing the situation on the Korean Peninsula. And they talk about stability and peace and have expectations about stability and peace. And can we split the DPRK from China? Well, for 6.5 years after Kim Jong-un took power, the relations were not good with China. They purged Chang Song-taek and also purged pro-Chinese factions, such as and Kim Jong-nam was also killed. But then now the China-DPRK relations have improved with the invasion of Ukraine. Now, from the U.S. perspective, we need to focus on the weakness of the DPRK and China's weak spot to counter the U.S.-China hegemonic war. Now, the semiconductor conflict with Japan and the urea crisis with China. Well, given all this, the economy and has been included in the comprehensive partnership between the U.S. and Korea, and the U.S. wants Korea to engage more. And in that process, how can we utilize the DPRK? Then we could use it as a hub that can replace China. And Korea is a cutting-edge technology powerhouse. So if we were to use the DPRK as a hub for low-end product manufacturing, then it could help the decoupling strategy of the U.S. Now, we could divide and rule we divided and ruled China and Russia. Now the same should go for the DPRK. Last but not least, so far, we have been studying the strategies of the great powers. What do they have in their mind? And we focused on our response to it. So we have been very responsive. We were not aggressive enough. However, for now, we need to design our own fate, and we need to shape our own landscape. Because the impact can be limited, we need to create and design our own fate, and sometimes we need to use the self-interest of the neighboring countries in our favor. Now, of course, we should act as a bridge, but after we reach a détente between the two Koreas and become closer with China, then we can move on to the next step. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. You talked about whether the DPRK can be the next Vietnam. You said that once we resolve the geopolitical tension in the region, then we could consider that. You talked about the vision of the region, and also you talked about the clash, the geopolitical clash in the region, and I think that you echoed what Mr. Kim mentioned. Thank you very much for that. And last but not least, you also talked about using the DPRK as a production hub for economic and security. And if we were to use the self-interest of the neighboring countries, then maybe we could reach a détente, achieve a détente between the two Koreas.
Our next speaker is Mr. Kim Young-jun. The previous two speakers gave us a broad overview, and I believe that our next speaker will take a more military-specific view. So his presentation is on the threat of DPRK China-Russia military cooperation and the need to change DPRK-U.S. relations. After the sixth nuclear test in 2017, there was a military meeting, inter-Korean meeting in the Philippines, and I took part in those meetings. And so this was right after the sixth nuclear test. And that is why we were joined by a very high level official. And so the Blue House was completely in chaos trying to interpret what this meant. And there was a lot of flurry of activities then. I was quite surprised then that the North Korean generals were at the reception area and they were taking selfies without any bodyguards. And of course, I was keeping my distance. And they had just conducted the sixth nuclear test, and this was an experience that showed me how the attitude and how the North Koreans had changed. And afterwards, I met with the president of the Future Consensus Institute, and I told him how the North has changed and that they are likely to become more bold in their negotiations. And my logic was the same with Professor Lee's. Peace doesn't have much meaning for the U.S. The U.S. actually does not care about economic cooperation or economic development. So we needed to say that North Korea can be used to contain China. But at the same time, we need to perhaps give them a status or recognition like we do to Middle East countries. So this was the deal that we made. And in Korea at the time, there were talks about a new peninsula initiative, and there were talks about a 5-year plan. And so that was the time I started to talk about how North Korea could be the next Vietnam. And back then, I would meet with U.S. lawmakers, and they were not very interested in the peace initiative on the Korean Peninsula. And the logic that we had at the time was not very attractive to them. They have no reason to support the Korean peace initiative when it comes at a cost of withdrawing U.S. FK and acknowledging dictatorship. So the Korean peace initiative itself is fine, but the logic or the grounds to convince the U.S. is very weak. It's very well known now that Mr. Choi Son-hee was in the lobby and nodding off, and he offered, because the talks were going nowhere, that they were willing to denuclearize if the U.S. were to normalize ties then and there. When the meetings were going well, a high-level North Korean official say that if the issue is clear, then THAAD can be installed in North Korea. So what this means is that North Korea is willing to do anything if ties with the U.S. Is normalized. And in fact, if you look at the U.S., they have a number of countries where they acknowledge a dictatorship. Look at the Middle Eastern country. If you look at Turkey or some other countries, if you look at it from the DPRK perspective, the U.S. is already acknowledging many dictatorships. And I think we need to develop a logic for other parties to this issue as well. We come up with ideas like economic cooperation and economic integration. Of course, the U.S. would be interested if this means money for U.S. companies, and U.S. companies will be able to do business here. But that is not the case. If it were the case, then we would have Capitol Hill, the U.S. Capitol Hill, supporting our ideas. We need to develop a logic and grounds for our solutions and issues that can convince the U.S. You can see that these events were held what seemed like ages ago, but now we're in a new Cold War structure. In order for this warming of ties to occur again, we need to develop a logic that can be bought. You can see that Kim Jong-un continues with his grandfather's style of management, and these are some of the strategic goals of Kim Jong-un. Kim Il-sung was able to build an autocratic nation because he was able to put in place supporters when there was generational change. He, at the time, educated the poor and the farmers, and they were sent abroad to study, and they were brought back, and they became the new middle class. So he created a new middle class, and this middle class lives in apartments in Pyongyang right now, and they live with their grandchildren. And Kim Jong-un is actually focusing on economic building so that he can do the same. He can place a lot of supporters when there is a generational change. And they are seeking independence from China as well. And they consider the biggest enemy not the U.S., but those who are pro-Chinese. This was the case like several decades ago. And then, of course, the main enemy were people within, like Chang Song-taek. So if you look at the history, if you look at the golden times of Kim Il-sung, it was during the Eisenhower era. This was the 1950s, 60s. This is what Donald Trump is pursuing. Kim Jong-un looks to the golden era of North Korea as a time when his grandfather was in power. That was when North Korea was actually economically better off than South Korea. So he is very stern with his officials, but tries to convey an image of generosity and love for the people, for the ordinary North Koreans. And this is a photo of Kim Jong-un at a daycare center. I'm sure some people in the picture got promoted. This is Pyongyang. This water park is in Pyongyang. This isn't Caribbean Bay in South Korea. And this isn't built for a couple of people. It's for tens of thousands of people. So who are the people here? These are the middle class of North Korea. Whether it's smartphone or not, there is a middle class that uses smartphones that usually cost 24 months of wages. So unless the middle class withdraws their support, it is unlikely that the regime will collapse for within. So the people surrounding Kim Jong-un are content. So it's difficult to expect a rebellion or opposition within North Korea just because we send over some leaflets condemning the regime. So all of this, this isn't just for sports competition. Nobody knows the exact figure, but there's about 10 to 20% of the middle class. This class has children who go to nice schools, who get money from Donju, and they're perfectly content with the way things are. And this is what provides the background for a stable regime for Kim Jong-un. So then what is the situation for us? If the Korea, Japan, U.S. Can collaborate, then the U.S. Will pursue this. But what we forget is that we have to consider the possibility of the DPRK cooperating with China and Russia. Initially, when the DPRK showed interest in collaborating with China and Russia, everybody thought it was a show, but now not so more. You can see that in 2014, the main enemy of the Vostok enemy was considered China, but now you can see that China is standing there side by side. If you look at most of the research going on right now is on Taiwan, but the second most hottest topic is just when the DPRK will join China and Russia in military exercise. And for us, we need to look at the costs of this sort of DPRK China-Russia cooperation versus our cooperation. And if these military exercises were to occur off the sea of North Korea, there's nothing we can do. But since the 1950s, there has been a ban on foreign military presence in North Korea. But if we were to push North Korea into the embrace of China and Russia, then this could become a reality. And China may have or design new military operation plans that include striking Seoul, and the same goes for Russia. So we need to think about the possibility of the DPRK, China and Russia coming together as we, or the U.S., pursues a linkage between NATO and the Indo-Pacific region. So in 2024, if Trump is to be re-elected, then everything we have, we would need to revisit. If the Biden administration or the Democrats continue to be in power, then of course the current trend would continue. And if Trump were to be re-elected, then we would have the issues that I have mentioned that need to be explored further. So if Trump comes back, these are some of the things that I've listed that we need to take a look at. You can see here a picture of Kushner and Ivanka at Panmunjom. Kushner went to the Middle East and said that if the meeting with Trump goes well, then they would have great investments into North Korea. So Trump probably had in mind a plan to turn North Korea into the second Vietnam. And in expanding our cooperation with Japan and the U.S. and NATO, we need to keep in mind that North Koreans are no fools. So if we were to attempt at new military cooperation and alliances, then this will certainly have an impact on the actions of the DPRK. So what are some of our policy options? In the past, we relied on sanctions. We expected North Korea to collapse. The Korean peace process didn't really work, but I think that we need to further develop the Korean peace process as a fourth option. So this is the strategic goal of Kim Jong-un. If he can achieve what is here on the slide, then he might be satisfied. And so if there are some elements here that we can accept, then we would be able to develop logic that can satisfy both North Korea and the U.S. Thank you very much, Professor Kim. After your presentation, I am reliving the Trump dilemma we had when he was in office. He gave us a lot of behind-the-scenes stories. He told us how North Korea was very committed to building new relations with the U.S. He also talked about the special features of the DPRK and China relations. And he also touched upon the military alliance between the DPRK, China, and Russia. He talked about how post-Taiwan, there is more investment in research regarding the possibility of DPRK Russia-China military training. And I think we can condense this presentation into one keyword, the fourth option. Next, I would like to invite Dylan Motin from Kangwon University for his presentation.
The title of his presentation is the U.S.-China Strategic Competition and a New Solution to the U.S.-DPRK Relations. Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction. So to sum up my presentation, I would like to say that the political landscape is favorable to improve the U.S., the DPRK relations. So first and foremost, I would like to briefly talk about the global strategies designed by the U.S. So the purpose is to make sure that it forms an alliance in Asia and Europe. Now it is trying to exclude China and Russia. So Japan, Australia, and well, they are part of Quad. And India is also part of Quad. But the US cannot contain China on its own. It needs the support of its allies. So the US is making sure to contain China so that it does not win hegemony in the region. So now it's refraining from providing human rights assistance, and it wants to use the alliance network to the most. And I believe that we need to understand the DPRK in this context. Because of the nuclear weapons, of course, nuclear weapons was a key issue in the US. However, now the Korean Peninsula has been pushed at the priority list of the US because of China. So if you look at this, now it looks like the US is not interested in the DPRK issue. But I think that, well, this can turn into a golden opportunity, although many think that this is a problem. Since many countries are afraid of China, I believe that that can really push countries to come together to turn this crisis into an opportunity. So as the previous speaker mentioned, the former General Brooks proposed that we need to improve the Korea-DPRK-U.S. relations and suggested that the DPRK should join the arms alliance against Russia. So to successfully contain China, the U.S. needs to improve its relations with the DPRK. And we have questions about the implications of this remark. If, well, the two Koreas are afraid of each other and they are in an arms race, and because of that, China cannot become aggressive. And the same goes for the U.S. The U.S. needs to pay close attention to the landscape, the political landscape in the region. And
아시아 대륙에 중국은
in Asia,
경쟁력을 가지기 때문에
China has a competitive edge.
할 수 있는 상황입니다.
So it has the ability and the resources to mobilize
아시아 대륙
its
군사력을
troops
계산해봤는데
overseas.
이 각 나라가
If you look at the ground forces of neighbors in China, you can have an idea of the scale and the strength of the ground forces of the DPRK, South Korea, U.S., and China. If the forces of the DPRK was to be reduced by 3 times, then you can have an idea of what the outcome will look like. So now, by wisely utilizing this situation, by improving the relations with the DPRK, that means that we can turn the situation in our favor. And the US will be able to achieve its goal. And the neighboring countries are, of course, afraid about the rise of China. But what we tend to forget is this. If you look at the planet, where's the US? It's not here. So the US is far away from the DPRK, but China is not. China is very close to the DPRK. So this shows us how we should define our relations, be it allies or enemies. Now, these are some comments coming from the DPRK directed to China. These are some of the remarks. Here, people think that the DPRK and China are close friends, but if you look at the remarks, then that does not seem to hold true. There are many military provocations, not only between the two Koreas, but also between the DPRK and China. And the DPRK wants to reduce its reliance on China. And many Chinese companies have been seized or have been subject to fraud. And I'm sure that you still remember the purging of Jang Song-taek a few years back. And he was the one who promoted investment in China. And how does the DPRK perceive the US? They want to improve their relations with the US, and they want to partner with the US. And the US focuses on denuclearization and the spread of democracy. Those are the two reasons why the DPRK has a hard time to give up its cards. But if we could set aside denuclearization, if we could use the fear that countries have against China, I believe that we could really change the situation. Well, the US DPRK relations were improving, but it soured during the Bush administration. And Kim Jong-un, when he met Clinton Kim Jong-il, when he met Clinton back in 2009, this is what he said to the president. if the Democrats had won in 2000, the situation in bilateral relations would not have reached such a point.
그 주변에 있는 위험한 강국 때문이라고 했고
So
세계 세력 균형이 변화되는
the United States would have had a new friend in Northeast Asia in a complex world. He also said that the global power relationships are changing.
우리가 중국을 봉쇄할 수 있게 동맹하자는
To sum up, he sent
미국에 대한 인식을
a message that he was willing to form a partnership with the U.S. Now, this is from the DPRK's 노동신문,
노동신문에 미국에 대한
and the number of views of imperialism and the U.S.
아니면 미제라는
So how many times the newspaper use these two terminology? As you can see here, the number dramatically decreased from 2017.
미국은 다른 태평양 국가들과 함께
The U.S. together with other Pacific countries are taking action. Well, that was the headline of a news article. But in that article, we could not find any harsh comments directed to the U.S. Now, the U.S. is not prioritizing the North Korean issue, which is why we are now stuck and are not making any progress. But when communicating with the regime, I believe that we need to reframe the way we converse with Pyongyang. So far, our message was this: only through multilateral talks will the North Korean problem be resolved. However, we saw from experience that this will not succeed, and it is very unlikely to succeed by pursuing multilateral talks. Now we need to focus our message on containment of China. So the DPRK is also afraid of the rise of China. So as the former General Brooks mentioned, we should use the remark on the right to convince the U.S. to pay more attention to the DPRK issue. And the reason why Russia can pressure NATO is because they are subject to no geopolitical risks in Northeast Asia. So they're not afraid of China. However, to convince the U.S., we have to say that, well, if the DPRK comes to our side, that can cause a problem because Vladivostok is right next to the DPRK, and that can cause more difficulty on NATO. But anyways, those are some of the factors that we need to consider. Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. So I think that you agreed to the previous speakers, but you talked about the ground forces, which was unique. You compared the military strength of North Korea, South Korea, U.S. and China, and you said that by combining forces, then we could outperform North Korea. You also talked about Kim Jong-il's remark with Clinton. You went into details to tell us what they discussed, and you also said that we need to focus our message on the containment strategy against China. Thank you very much.
So we heard from our four presenters. When we began the session, I told our online participants that if you take a picture of the QR code, you can post your questions. So if you have any questions, please make use of the QR code. And also for our participants here, if you have any questions, please jot them down and we will try to entertain them during the Q&A session after the discussion. As mentioned earlier, we are joined by two discussants. The first is Professor Jiyoung of Seoul National University. He has a presentation titled Japan's Role in Applying the Vietnamese Model to North Korea. Thank you for this opportunity to take part in this session. I am a Japanese scholar and I take a look at international politics from Japan's perspective, so I will try to do my best during this session. I would like to thank the four presenters for their presentations. It was very interesting. Mr. Kim talked about a geopolitical imagination. And I think the four presentations talked about geopolitical imagination in a sense. Thank you for your presentation. I think although the point was slightly different, I think all presentations stated the need for strategic balance in the region. South Korea's diplomacy needs to take in mind new strategic balance. And we need our imagination for that. And we call on imagination because the geopolitical landscape is changing at a very fast pace. Of course, it's important to prepare and respond to these changes. The collapse of the Cold War or the reconciliation of U.S. and China, these were all unexpected, so it was difficult to prepare for them. And so it is, of course, ideal to try to prepare for the future. I think that, however, at the same time, we have to take a look at the reality. And if taking a look at reality, if Japan becoming a normal state, if we were to embrace North Korea, try to make it a more normal actor of the international community, I think that we need to consider this issue further. As I mentioned earlier, there is significant change in the geopolitical space. And even if we premise what we are about to say in a more gradual scenario, I still believe that Japan will play a very important role in the future. So I really thank you for this opportunity to talk about this. I think that Japan tends to be overlooked when it comes to this topic. Historically, during the Kim Dae-jung administration, I think Japan was taken into more consideration. And I think that it actually helped very much in resolving the North Korean issues at the time. So this is what I want to point out at the outset. I brought many points to bring up during the discussion. I will bring up the slides as needed. Before we go on, I want to begin with a question. U.S.-China strategic competition is leading to a new strategic balance. If you look at the strategic competition between U.S. and China, it is intensifying. It is not easing at all. And within this strategic competition, countries need to respond. And I think we have imagined these various scenarios under this scenario. North Korea still feels threatened by China, and it is still concerned by China still. And so I'm not quite sure if North Korea would join the bandwagon with China and Russia. From North Korea's perspective, the U.S. is an enemy, but China, which it borders with, is also a significant threat. And that's why in talks with Trump, I think North Korea continued to meet with China to contain China. So I'm not quite sure North Korea will think that improving ties with Japan and the U.S. Because of China is reasonable. Even if unification is the way the Korean Peninsula goes forward, we have to think about security and society and culture. Are we building a favorable dynamic if we were to pursue unification against this backdrop? The U.S.-Sino strategic competition, I believe, is intensifying, and I think the goal should be to ease the strategic competition in the region. Professor Kim Young-jun proposed the fourth scenario, or the fourth option. I think in preparing for this fourth option, we need to keep a fifth scenario in mind, and we have to remember that the fifth scenario may well be needed. The fifth scenario is creating a space in between U.S. and China. I think North Korea, South Korea, and Japan, these three countries could occupy that space between the U.S. and China. So we can have a trilateral dynamic, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan in the middle. Since the Ukraine war, there are some countries who are resisting falling into this black hole in international politics. Turkey, India, Indonesia, Philippines. They are trying to keep their balance between U.S. and China. And I think that perhaps connecting and linking with these countries is important. And perhaps we can embrace or try to bring North Korea into that fold of trying to keep balance. Because we are out of time, I think it'll be difficult for us to go through my deck one by one. But if you look at my deck, it shows the importance of Japan in dealing with North Korea, and I show the history of this. So if Japan is important, I want to talk about how can we utilize Japan in our new strategic strategy. So in order to do that, we have to look at the political landscape of China. Japan can be categorized based on this matrix. So in Korea, it seems that the swing to the right is very large, and then on the opposite side are the scholars who resist this. So here, number 1 and number 4 have very loud voices, and it seems that 2 and 3 are not they don't have a very large presence, but in fact, 2 and 3 have a large presence. And so, if you look at Abe and Abe supporters, they had a large presence, and so that is why number 3, the people who support the revision of Constitution and Korea-U.S. alliance have a larger voice. But if you look at other Japanese politicians, they occupy different spaces in this political landscape. Japan's reality is also reflected in number 2. The liberals in Japan, I think, need to be heard in Japan's political landscape. We have to think about how we can connect with these liberalists and make them partners in our endeavor. But there's another political landscape that has to do with the comfort women or the sex slaves during the Second World War. We need to be able to see the specific spaces between this landscape. We need to differentiate those who are for and against this issue, and we need to find partners. Japan's realists, I believe, are the partners for a new strategic initiative. But if we were to cooperate with the Japanese realists, we may be sucked into a trilateral alliance too quickly. So we have to think about the purpose of our endeavor. I don't know about the process, but we need to be very clear about a purpose. And we need to think about our initiatives and check whether it can help us fully realize our purpose. So I think we need to cooperate with the number 2 occupiers in Japan. And we also need to strike a balance in our relationship between China and the U.S. And I think that Japan is doing the same thing right now. And with that, I would like to conclude my comments. Thank you very much, Professor Nam. I think he posed a very important question. I think that is at the crux. So, the two Koreas and U.S. alliance, is this beneficial? Will this benefit the Korean Unification scheme? Will it raise tension on the Korean Peninsula? And he also proposed that we should also consider the 5th option of striking a balance between the U.S. and China. And we could also think about aligning with other countries who are occupying the middle space, trying to strike a balance between U.S. and China. And he also mentioned that there are some moderates in Japan like Kishida who are for protecting the constitution and a U.S.-Japan alliance.
Last but not least, we have with us Senior Research Fellow Mr. Lee Chol of the Peace Foundation, who will talk about the perspective of the DPRK. How will North Korea respond? Will it accept this offer? Will it join the new Northeast Asian Order? That will be the title of his discussion. Yes. Thank you very much for the great presentations. So it was great to listen to great ideas, and I hope that those ideas will turn into action. So now I would like to give you some of the commentaries and give you my idea about whether the DPRK is likely to join the shaping of a new Northeast Asian order or not. I would like to present in 2 parts. First, why did Kim Jong-un sit with Trump at the DPRK-U.S. summit? And number 2, strategic proposals to drive change in the regime, and then briefly conclude. Then why did Kim Jong-un sit with Trump at the U.S. DPRK summit? Let alone the DPRK-U.S. summit, there is no inter-Korean exchanges. So let us briefly look back on what happened. As you know, since he took power, Kim Jong-un carried out reform. He granted autonomy to factories and enterprises. And he also kicked off the sub-work team management system and vegetable garden responsibility system. And also, he introduced economic regulations. Also, in the academic sector, North Korea started publishing mathematical papers in international academic journals in 2004. But actually, about 202 articles were published in the Kim Jong-un era. And now, North Korean scientists who used to co-author papers, they are now the sole author of the majority of papers. Then what drove this change? What does Kim Jong-un have in his mind? Why is he pushing mathematical progress? Let us briefly think about the prerequisite for reform and opening up. So opening up means you need to open doors to other countries. But the DPRK has great enemies. He has to choose whether to form an alliance with that country or whether to stay enemies with that country. So the Hanoi summit suggested that the DPRK chose the latter. Then who is Kim Jong-un? When assessing people in the DPRK, the North Koreans tend to believe that the worldview defines the person. So the way he was brought up, he grew up, really defines the person. And the worldview tends to be formed until university. Then who is Kim Jong-un? Kim Jong-un studied in West Europe as a child with his brother and sister. And that's when he formed his view of the world. So the economic reform as well as other initiatives that Kim Jong-un has pursued are based on his experience in Switzerland. And back in 2000, he also met Kenji Fujimoto, who was the Japanese chef for his father. And in a train, on a train connecting Wonsan and Pyongyang, he conversed with the chef about the situation in the DPRK, the minerals, and so on. And economy, trade, service, and tourism were some of the topics that he discussed with Kenji. And during that time, he used to show envy about countries with a vibrant trade and economy. Now, about North Korea's conflicting rhetoric towards the U.S., which one is true? North Korea tends to verbally attack the U.S., but then on the other side, the North Korean officials use different rhetorics on international settings, in different international settings. For instance, Workers' Party Secretary Kim Yong-sun stated that he did not oppose the presence of U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula in a meeting with acting U.S. Secretary of State Cantor and Vice Marshal Jo Myung-rok. Also reaffirmed the same position during his visit of the U.S. Then, which one is true out of the conflicting two rhetorics? Now, during the Hanoi summit, Kim Jong-un and Trump exchanged remarks, and one day prior to the summit, Trump and Kim Jong-un met at the Sofitel Legend Metropole Hotel and took a short 4-minute walk in the hotel garden. And nobody has paid close attention to the remarks, but this is what they said to one another. During the walk, Trump asked Kim Jong-un, "Do you think this meeting will be successful?" And to which Kim Jong-un confidently replied, "I am sure." then let us look at what made Kim Jong-un confident of the success. So one day after the talks began in Hanoi, and during the talks, Kim Jong-un proposed a plan to dismantle the DPRK's Yongbyon nuclear facility and jointly verify it with U.S. experts. And in return, the Supreme Leader asked for a partial lifting of sanctions that hampered the civilian economy and the livelihood of people out of the 5 UN sanctions on North Korea that took effect between 2016 and 2017. However, the deal failed. The US said that the DPRK deceived the international community by offering to dismantle an almost outdated nuclear facility. But most of the nuclear materials are produced in Yongbyon. Other than Yongbyon, they have Pyeongsan uranium facility. And during the Hanoi meeting, they also talked about this Hwangsan area nuclear complex, however, that needs to be verified. Then what did the US experts say? On March 11th of 2019, Began, who served as a special representative for North Korea at the time, said Yongbyon is a comprehensive industrial complex related to North Korea's nuclear fuel cycle and nuclear weapons development. In other words, it was emphasized that Yongbyon is a comprehensive and core industrial complex for North Korea's nuclear facilities. And on the same day, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Christopher Hill, said President Trump should have accepted the North Korean offer to dismantle the Yongbyon nuclear facility because he proposed that the DPRK opens doors for inspection of its nuclear facilities during the six-party talk. However, that did not happen because the DPRK refused. But the same offer was put on the table during the Hanoi talk. That's why Christopher Hill mentioned that Trump should have accepted the offer. Now, I would like to make a few proposals to change the DPRK. What about the global landscape? Well, under Trump, conflict sparked over the US and China intellectual property rights, trade, and the South China Sea. And now that escalated to the Hong Kong issue, Taiwan issue, the Xinjiang autonomous region issue. And they're threatening the world that they're not afraid of going into war. And I'm sure that you know that the US visit to Taiwan recently sparked anger among the Chinese people. And Putin launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine. And it is highly likely that Russia will use nuclear warheads. And what about Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula? The DPRK broke the self-imposed moratorium of the past 3 years and has conducted a total of 33 missile tests as of June 30th. And China must struggle with its next move given the war in Ukraine. China will be looking at the scale of the war, the scope, the repercussion of the war to calculate its next move with respect to Taiwan. Now, this is the forecast and outlook. During the 8th Party Congress, Kim Jong-un said that although good faith efforts and maximum patience were exerted, the U.S. Did not take their hostile policy toward the DPRK down a notch, but on the contrary. So this means that we went to Hanoi, we tried to sit at the negotiation table with the U.S., but the U.S. did not change their stance. And Kim recommits itself to building and strengthening nuclear arsenal and strengthening military power. So the forecast is this: North Korea is doubling down its efforts on fully preparing the regime for a possible conflict on the Korean Peninsula, as the issues of Ukraine, Taiwan, and Korean Peninsula are all connected. So we need ground forces, especially well, now, next to Taiwan, we only have U.S. troops in Korea and Japan. Then with intermediate missiles, China could hit these two bases. And then, if that happens, then Korea will react immediately. And when Pelosi visited Korea, we talked about those issues as well. Then what about forming a new ROC DPRK-U.S. relations? Is an alliance between these three countries an impossible dream or a possibility? Well, the reality is that China and Russia are the only countries that recognize North Korea as is and provide economic and material assistance to the regime. So the DPRK has a pragmatic view and approach, and so does China, which is called 실리주의 and 실사주의. So what we can do here is, if we were to provide the same level of economic and material assistance to Pyongyang, will Pyongyang remain the same, or will it change its stance? So we need to predict how the DPRK will behave if the U.S. was to take over the role of China and Russia. For now, we need to remove distrust, and this is our number one priority. North Korea has deep mistrust of the U.S. So the U.S. offers a comprehensive deal. However, the DPRK cannot accept that offer because it does not trust Washington. So from a strategic point of view, to induce change in the DPRK, we need to remove the regime's deep distrust of the U.S. And we also need to respect the agreement between the two Koreas and between the U.S. and DPRK to build trust. After Moon Jae-in took office, his administration has devoted much attention and effort to the improvement and development of inter-Korean relations. However, his administration has been criticized by the DPRK for increasing its armaments worth 290 trillion and bringing in advanced military equipment and continuing ROC U.S. military exercises. Then to improve the inter-Korean relations and the U.S. DPRK relations, we need to continue to provide humanitarian assistance to the regime. And if we were to continue these projects, then we need to be aware that the DPRK is not happy with the terminology humanitarian aid. So let us change that terminology to mutual help projects or something of that sort. This is my last slide. We need to take a strategic approach to sanctions against North Korea. So if we are to strategically invite North Korea and encourage the regime to join the U.S.-ROK DPRK alliance, the challenges involving North Korea needs to be approached strategically. So we have been trying different options. But the previous speakers talked about former General Brooks. And what did he say? In his article in Foreign Affairs, he said a better approach is to propose a path that Kim Jong-un wants the most. And we need to take a stock. We need to really review this comment. Why is he saying this? So I talked about the two parts. So this is my conclusion. So before leaving office, President Moon Jae-in recalled the meeting with Kim Jong-un in his Going Away documentary and said, well, Kim Jong-un was very honest. Kim said that he was willing to remove nuclear weapons if only the security of the regime is guaranteed and peace is secured, and talked a lot about how to make the U.S. believe in its genuine intentions. We need to conduct extensive studies and come up with action plans on how to get Kim Jong-un to join the ROK-U.S. alliance system and what to offer him to guarantee the security of the regime. And last but not least, we also need to reflect on whether hatred toward the North Korean regime alone can solve the North Korean nuclear problem, and if not, have the determination to abandon that path and choose another one. And once we reach a conclusion, we must start acting with a sense of duty for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Lee. We are behind time, about 10 minutes. And my understanding is that we don't have much time to move to the next session. But let us continue on with the Q&A session now. So Mr. Lee talked about the worldview of Kim Jong-un, his childhood and his education in the West, and talked about the Hanoi summit and the one-on-one talk with Trump, and talked about the conditions that we need to set. And he also talked about the strategic proposal. He agreed with the previous speakers and emphasized the need for trust building and humanitarian assistance to the DPRK to improve the inter-Korean relations. Now, please remember the name Vincent Brooks, and I'm sure that you will remember because he came up like 5 times during the session. Now, we'll receive some questions from the floor, and I would like to ask the presenters to comment on what Mr. Nam said.
I'm Kim Jong-han, and I actually used partial leave to attend this forum. Today, I would like to thank the presenters for their presentation. China seems to be emerging, and the U.S. seems to be deteriorating. That's what I've been told. Perhaps instead of us trying to bring North Korea in, why don't we lean towards North Korea? In the long term, they say, many futurists say, that China will emerge stronger than the U.S. at some point in the future. And so why not join China early on? I think it's a comment and a question. Is it a question for somebody? I don't mind. Anybody who would like to pitch in, please. Would anybody, should I ask more questions first? Do we have any other questions from the floor?
예, 전 장군님. 마이크.
I agree with what was said wholeheartedly, and I think that is the only way too. I agree with that. But I'm not sure if I missed it, but I would like to raise one point. Who is going to give South Korea a security guarantee? We can't keep U.S. forces here forever. Are we going to withdraw U.S. forces, and are we going to side with China? And will we introduce a system where people who oppose are sent to psychiatric wards, or where people are going to be shot dead? So who is going to guarantee South Korea's security? That is my question. I think the presentations today were very radical, if you will, and I think the questions are very radical as well. Do we have any more questions? So if not, then I would like to invite our panelists to give an answer on the Two Koreas China alliance, and the second question on who is going to provide a security guarantee for South Korea. And I would also like our panelists to answer or offer their thoughts on Professor Nam's comments about how the proposed alliance may bring instability or raise tension on the Korean Peninsula. You talked about how we should side with China, and the premise is that China is emerging and the U.S. is perhaps deteriorating. But I have to say, I don't think that that premise itself is right. Many people believe that the U.S. Economy is in decline, and that the U.S. is likely to deteriorate as a superpower. But from my perspective, I don't think that the U.S. will be weakening overnight. The U.S. has a great innate power. If you look at the global financial system, it is based on the U.S. dollar, and China has emerged from that dollar system, so it's very difficult for China to break away from that. Of course, in terms of military power, China and Russia have really caught up with the U.S., but if you look at the financial system, and we live in a global financial system, it is still operated centrally by the U.S. So in my view, I don't think that China will easily be able to overshadow the U.S. by creating its own system and own order. So I think it will take a very, very long time for that to happen. So the premise itself, I think, is quite radical. What we need to be thinking of right now is what will happen in the next 5 to 10 years. So in the short to midterm, how are we going to establish a peace system on the peninsula in the next 5 to 10 years? We need to think about what kind of peace initiative is needed for Northeast Asia in 5 to 10 years. And I believe we need to establish a peace process on the Korean Peninsula by improving relations between the DPRK and the U.S. I believe that is the first step. That is my opinion. And with regards to what Professor Nam mentioned earlier, I think he raises a very important point. I think basically the two Koreas, the U.S. and Japan, they can be an ally. Of course, from China's perspective, it could be seen as a containment by the four parties. And there is a possibility there are concerns that this could raise tensions, and I think that's only natural. But from our perspective, we have to think about how we can build a peace system, a peace mechanism internally on the Korean Peninsula. And from that perspective, I believe an improved relation between DPRK and the U.S. is necessary.
지금 북한과 미국의 관계 개선이 되고
If relations are improved between the DPRK and the U.S. and South Korea and Japan can improve relations, I don't think that even so, we don't have to go to an extreme confrontational relationship. China has a relationship with China. We have normalized ties. And if the DPRK establishes ties with the U.S. and engages in exchange, it doesn't mean that all hostile elements will be eradicated overnight. I think that we have to look at this process. As Professor Nam said, there will be many interim steps along the way, realistically speaking.
Yes, thank you very much for the discussion. And I think that Professor Nam posed a very important question. Of course, we have to keep that in mind. And between the US and China, we need to make the right decisions. And I'm very much interested in devising the right solution for that because I was desperate to find the answer. The possibility of a war is imminent in Korea, especially given the US-China strategic war, which will continue to unfold for the next decades. Of course, China will not be able to surpass the US completely. However, that does not mean that the US will have a firm upper hand over China. So we cannot side with one country only because the strategic war will not end anytime soon. So if this continues for the next few decades, we cannot pick sides. We have to be cautious. And given this hegemonic war, of course, it is not likely to have a full-scale war, but a limited war over the Taiwan Strait is possible. Even if we were to win in the war, then that is not the end of everything. So what we need to do is we need to do everything possible to prevent the limited war. And of course, China will not help the DPRK to become an autonomous country and become self-reliant. It will only provide limited assistance. So given this backdrop, I believe that there is possibility of a war, and when the DPRK has a leverage, because of that leverage, we can convince countries to stay away from a possible war because of that leverage. And in the future, given the Korea-U.S. alliance, well, from the U.S. perspective, improving inter-Korean relations did not benefit the U.S. much. However, going forward, we have to make sure that we engage the U.S. and let them know that there's much at stake for the U.S. as well. Just like Columbus of the past, we should pave into an uncharted territory, contribute lead to peace.
우리 한반도 내에서의 평화가
And
구축된 다음에
once we establish a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, then I believe that we can serve as a bridge between continental and maritime powers. But first, we need to improve inter-Korean relations. We need to be realistic. We have to adopt realistic strategies and options. Yes, thank you very much for that.
I will try to keep it short. I think in the mid to long term, if China surpasses the U.S. and the U.S. is no longer the democracy that we know. If China becomes a better country in 50 to 100 years, I think maybe then we can consider that. But if you look at history for the past 2,000 years, no neighboring country has guaranteed our sovereignty. So I think that it is a very provocative topic, but that is what I think. One of my closest colleagues is a Korean-American female general, and she is now writing a thesis on the topic. So I think the dialogue itself is meaningful, but as long as China it remains the way it is and does not become a country that embodies the values that we pursue, I think that it is unlikely. But I think that that was a very good topic, good food for thought. And Professor Nam talked about the fifth option, where the two Koreas and Japan form a trilateral cooperation or mechanism. And another presenter mentioned the new Southern policy as well. And I think that the post-Helsinki process model will not be adoptable for the time being. So if it's not the two Koreas and Japan, I think that there may be other options. But in looking at new options and fourth and fifth options, we need to keep in mind that the U.S.-China strategic competition will be ongoing for about 30 to 50 years. So I think maybe we can try to build a gray zone. So we don't want to engage in fight, but perhaps build a gray zone. And in terms of the security guarantee for South Korea, I think the Israeli model can be something that we can talk about. So temporarily, perhaps we can strike a balance. And I think that internally we may be able to have a discussion about the Israeli model with the U.S. Of course, this isn't something that we can do publicly, but I think that we need to keep an eye on the political situation. If Trump is reelected and if the USFK withdraws from Korea, I understand that Trump supporters are on the rise. If Trump is reelected and this in turn triggers change for the next 20, 30 years, then we would have to redo our math as well. So internally, I think we need to have those discussions under the circle. I agree with you on that. This is a topic that we need to touch upon.
예, 그 플로어에서 나온 질문은 절필
Yes.
답변하도록 하겠습니다.
So about the question, the cooperation between DPRK, ROC, and China. Well, during the past administration, Korea said that we need support from China to achieve our goals. And that was the assumption. But Beijing now dropped Korea, and once that happens, then the DPRK will go to Washington and say that we are afraid of inter-Korean relations. We want to become friends with China and Japan. So even if we were to take that direction, the allies will change, but Well, at the end of the day,
예,
not
시간이
much will
많이
change.
지나서 아마 다음
Yes, thank you very
세션
much for that. We are behind schedule, so
하겠습니다.
we have to wrap up now
동북아 지정학과 한반도
because we need to get the room ready for the following, the next session. We talked about the Northeast Asian geopolitics and détente of the Korean Peninsula, and I hope that the suggestions today can become the answer going forward. We may start little, but I hope that we can achieve much in the end. Thank you very much, presenters, for the presentations. Thank you very much, discussants, and thank you, participants, both online and offline, for joining us today. Thank you.